I'm Peter Fonagy. I'm Chief Executive of the Anna Freud Center, and a very warm welcome to the fourth on this series of the Anna Freud Center's Transformation Seminars. We are delighted that so many of you are able to join us tonight. I think we may have a record number of attendees for this seminar, which is, I believe, an indication of the unique accomplishments of tonight's speaker, but more about him later. These transformation seminars are carried out in a spirit of inquiry and collaboration. These discussions mean nothing without you, your questions and your thoughts. We hope that after today's seminar, you'll be inspired to continue to discuss some of the issues raised here today with friends and colleagues. We also hope that you will be able to join us throughout this series of seminars. All the information is on the website. The theme of the transformation seminars is thinking differently about mental health. The aim is to provide a public space where the interested public and professionals can join our speakers to reflect on how we might tackle the growing problem of child and family mental health. The seminars invite speakers to respond to a simple question. What is their idea for transforming children and families' mental health in the UK? We know that demand for mental health support is increasing and that this need cannot be met by professionals alone. The seminars explore areas beyond clinical interventions, important though these are, and ask how we can think about children's mental health differently, how we can do things in new ways, individually, collectively, and as a society, and reduce the growing challenges we face in relation to infants, children, young people, and their families' mental health. Do things differently as individuals and as communities in our complex and interconnected social world, and tackle some of the underlying causes of poor mental health. As we speak, we would like to invite you to ask some questions. You'll see at the bottom of the screen that there is a space for Q&A. And if you'd like to submit your questions, we'll try and get through as many of them as possible in the time that we have available. Finally, if you're tweeting, please tag us at AFNCCF and use the hashtag Transformation Seminars. But now to tonight's speaker, Eamon McCrory. I think this seminar is particularly important today as we live in a world where we are surrounded by events and experiences that can be experienced as traumatic, whether that's the impact of long-term neglect on child development or the impact of single incident trauma, such as a terrorist attack. Understanding how children and young people process these terrible experiences has moral dimensions as well as scientific ones. If you can understand how children and young people respond to trauma, we can help them rather than, as so often is the case, judge them and write them off sometimes. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce you today to Professor Eamon McCrory, whose pioneering work demonstrates how our neuroscience knowledge can help us understand better how we can support children who have experienced trauma. Professor McCrory read natural sciences at Cambridge University. He completed a PhD in cognitive neuroscience at UCL, and then obtained a professional doctorate in clinical psychology at King's College London. He's currently Professor of Neuroscience and Psychopathology at UCL Faculty of Brain Sciences. And together with Professor Essie Bidding, directs the Developmental Risk and Resilience Unit. His research uses brain imaging and psychological approaches to investigate the impact of childhood maltreatment on emotional development and mental health. He's also a visiting professor at the Child Study Center at Yale University. He has authored over 130 articles. And he's currently director of the UKRI Adolescent Wellbeing and Mental Health £35 million research program, and director of education here at the Anna Freud Center, where he has worked since 2006. Last year, as founder and co-director, he launched the UK Trauma Council, a project of the Anna Freud Center, set up to radically improve the help children and young people receive across the UK following traumatic events and experiences. He has advised the Royal Foundation and many voluntary and statutory organizations over recent years. He's an important leader in the field of child mental health and has been a key person in setting the direction of our center that we have traveled and will travel over the next years. Here at the Anna Freud Center, we know Professor McCrory as Eamon, as someone who is not just a brilliant academic and outstanding leader in the field, but also a friend. Someone who we value as much for what he has achieved as for how he has achieved it, for the remarkable wise person that he is. Eamon is super thoughtful and mega measured. He maintains an unwavering intellectual path, balancing the complexities of cutting-edge neuroscience, modern educational programming, intricate scientific policy, and the best interest of children, young people, and their families. Today, we are delighted to welcome him here to our Transformation Seminar to talk on childhood trauma and the brain. What have you learned from neuroscience? Eamon, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, very much for that very, very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you who've come this evening to listen to this talk, which is going to try, I think, in a very short amount of time, capture something of an overview of what we've learned from the field of neuroscience. So let me just share my slides and hopefully this will work. Great, so hopefully that is now clear. So what we have learned from neuroscience, what I really hope to do here is focus on one part of the field of neuroscience. Of course, we could be looking at evidence from animal studies or from adult studies who self-report childhood maltreatment. But given the time here and my own research interest, we're going to focus on what we have learned from empirical studies of children and adolescents, and that's going to be the primary focus today. But I suppose my title is a little bit misleading, and it's partly because of the task we're set here in the Transformation Seminar, because a large part of this talk in the second half is going to focus as much on what we still need to learn as much as what we have learned, and consider really the future challenges that we have in the field and where we should be going next. So, given that we have a very limited time, I really wanted to flag the resources that we have available on the UK Trauma Council website. As Peter mentioned, this was launched last year, and it's a platform to share guidance and resources across the UK. And we have a whole portfolio of resources around childhood trauma and the brain. And that includes a short animation, which really captures the core messages from neuroscience in an engaging 5-minute animation. There's also a free PDF guidebook that you can download that has been really richly illustrated to try to bring to life many of the things that I'll be talking about this evening. We have a set of explanatory videos and also deep dives for those of you who wish to really dig into the empirical findings. And finally, there's a series of science to practice videos that have been recorded by clinicians, by family therapists, by teachers and social workers who really think about how the neuroscience has been related to their everyday work with children who've experienced maltreatment. Okay, so the frame here is to try and understand the links between early adversity. So we can think about childhood trauma. Here we're really thinking about complex trauma, childhood abuse and neglect in particular. And we know from longitudinal studies that these experiences in childhood are associated with an increased risk of later poor outcome. So we can think in particular here about mental health, but it's worth bearing in mind that these experiences are associated with a range of broader poor outcomes, including physical health and economic productivity. And the endeavour that many of us are engaged in, including in the field of neuroscience, is really to try and understand what the pathways are, the developmental pathways, or we can also think about mechanisms, which is really another word for pathways. How can we think about what happens in childhood as impacting and influencing our experience and our well-being many years later? And neuroscience, it's really worth emphasizing, is simply one part of that multidisciplinary endeavor and one level of explanation that we really shouldn't see as more privileged than the psychological and the social aspects of this phenomenon. And why is this important? Well, childhood trauma is the largest non-modifiable risk factor for future mental health problems. And as Peter says, we really aren't going to tackle the societal challenge of child and young people's mental health by simply addressing the problem when it presents. So like with medical science, we need to move much more to the approach where we're seeking to prevent the emergence of problems in the first place. So to do that, we need a better understanding of how to reduce the risk of mental health problems emerging in the first place. And that requires this insight into the pathways and mechanisms whereby mental health problems may emerge over time. Childhood adversity can be understood as an environmental stressor. And it's important to remember, however, that there will also be genetic factors at play. So a child may experience a form of adversity, they may experience abuse and neglect, but that experience will impact different children in different ways because we all have different genetic propensities and responses. So there will be an interaction in a way between adversity and genetic predisposition. And that will be important in informing outcome. And those of you who are clinicians working with families will know that when you look at a sibling group, you can see very different outcomes in the same children in the same family. And part of that can be accounted for by individual differences in genes. But that's really beyond the scope of today's seminar. But I'm just asking you to bear in mind that there will always be individual differences. And even in the findings that I show you, these neuroscience studies average across all of our participants to show an overall group effect. But there will always be individual differences within that group or sample. And this interaction alongside the experiences that the child has across development, whether they experience future protective or risk factors, contribute to what we know is a broad range of possible outcomes. So some children who experience adversity grow up not to have any manifest disorder or difficulty, and others we know are less resilient and do develop a mental health problem or disorder. And what's really important to take away from this image is that the impact of childhood adversity is not deterministic. We know this is a probabilistic phenomenon, and that many children who experience adversity don't grow up to develop a problem. So that's really important to bear in mind, including when we look at these brain changes and we understand that they're encoding a vulnerability, they're not determining anybody's future. how I have tried to really get a hold of what is happening in the context of the developing brain and the exposure of that brain to early environments characterized by trauma, I've tried to get a handle of that by developing a framework. And we call that the theory of latent vulnerability. It's a framework that I've developed with S.E. Viding. And in this framework, we really think about how growing up in a household characterized by unpredictability or threat really poses some very particular challenges for the child. And that child needs to adapt to that environment. They need to cope, they need to survive in that environment. And part of the way they do that is through adaptation. And some of that adaptation we see in the brain. So the brain adapts to help that child cope. And then according to our theory of latent vulnerability, those adaptations become less helpful when the child moves into a safe or more predictable environment. And that causes a mismatch so that they're less well optimized to negotiate those environments. And that in part contributes to their vulnerability over time. So we can think of this here, and this is John, one of the characters from the animation that I mentioned, and he's growing up in a family characterized by domestic violence. And we can imagine, as we'll see later, that he may develop a pattern of hypervigilance to threat. And this is a pattern of neurocognitive adaptation that might help him survive and keep himself safe in this particular home environment. But we can imagine that when John moves into a different environment, when he goes into school, this pattern of hypervigilance in this more normative, predictable environment may become problematic. It may lead him to become more distractible or more reactive, and that may in turn compromise his ability to engage with his learning. So what's really interesting here is that what's happening to John isn't really a pattern of damage, it's a pattern of adaptation and then a mismatch when that adaptation no longer leads to optimal functioning in a new environment. So the question then, of course, becomes, how stable are these changes, and to what degree is there malleability and potential for these changes to kind of recalibrate over time? And perhaps we might get to that in some of the questions later. So latent vulnerability we can think of as adaptation of these neurocognitive systems to these particularly unpredictable or dangerous home environments that confer some functional advantages to the child, but which over time lead to this pattern of compromised ability to negotiate more normative contexts and potentially also future stressor events. And as you'll see, what's really interesting about these brain differences, and we'll be going through a series of them, is that they are seen in circuits that we know from other research are commonly associated with anxiety, with depression, with conduct disorder, all mental health problems very much associated with experiences of maltreatment. And what's really important to emphasize is that we see these brain changes in children well before mental health problems emerge. So this isn't a case of measuring these brain changes in children with manifest mental health disorder. We are able to document these brain changes well before the mental health problems manifest. And even in children for whom a mental health problem may never manifest. The field has sought to look at several domains of functioning, but the main domains of functioning have related to reward, threat, and memory processing, as well as to emotion regulation. But given that we've got a limited amount of time, I'm going to be focusing here on the first three, and we'll be going through these in turn. But there are a number of reviews available, including on the UK Trauma Council website. You can see further reading there for those of you who are interested. The dominant model is really then to think about how maltreatment, childhood trauma impacts the developing brain in ways that leads to patterns of alteration and adaptation. So there may be some aspects of brain changes that are not adaptive And this may particularly be the case when children, for example, are exposed to neglect. The brains don't have the necessary richness of inputs to develop in an optimal way. And this in turn leads to changes in behavior and cognition, and that these are obviously underpinned by what's happening in the brain. And these changes are just as important as what's happening at the brain. We're simply here talking about different levels of explanation of the same phenomena. And our current primary narrative in the field of developmental neuroscience is to think about how these patterns of alteration and adaptation confer increased susceptibility or vulnerability to the child. And we can think of this as a set of individual determinants that over time increase risk of mental health problems. And we might ascribe a name to this kind of narrative, a stress exposure model, so that a child experiences particularly high levels of stress. Some people have referred to this as toxic stress early in life. This leads to patterns of adaptation in the brain, leads to in turn changes at the psychological and behavioral level that make the individual more susceptible and vulnerable to mental health problems over time. Now, of course, most of us who work with children, who've worked with children, know that this cannot be the whole story. And this is the part of the talk that I really want to develop later that points to the direction of travel where we need to be going as a field. And in part, it is really founded on the observation that our mental health and well-being are intrinsically relational phenomena. And the pandemic and the lockdown and the fact that we're all sitting in our homes at the minute really brings home the way in which, for all of us, our well-being has been profoundly affected by the lack of normal social contact and engagement with others. So a child growing up will be really influenced by their family, by their community and their school and wider society. And their well-being will be a function of the social ecology that surrounds them. And what I just want you to, and this is obviously a standard ecological model, but I want to just draw out one aspect of this, which is that the social world around the child is something which is constructed and develops over time. And it is constructed and is developed through the interaction between the child and those around them, so that the child will bring a number of propensities and qualities and characteristics that will interact with the family that they're born into, and that over time this leads to a pattern of change. And that also plays out in the child's community, at their school, and in wider society, so that this interaction between the child and the world around them over time leads to the creation of the social worlds that we then have as adults. So we're not given a social world as adults. It unfolds through this pattern of interaction between the individual and the world around them. And this is the pathway, you might think of it as a socially mediated pathway to mental health vulnerability. And here we're thinking about how alterations in the brain systems might influence the way in which that iterative transactional process whereby one social world is constructed is impacted by childhood maltreatment or trauma. And I'm calling this here a social transactional model to try and really emphasize the way in which this is a social transaction between the child and those around them and the systems around them. And that this plays out across development in ways that can have profound implications for mental health and well-being. And we'll come back to that more fully later in the talk. But I just wanted to highlight at this point that we're going to be considering these two different pathways to latent vulnerability, the socially mediated pathway, but we're going to start with this individual pathway where we're looking at individual susceptibility and vulnerability that might arise from altered brain function as a consequence of the experience of abuse and neglect or trauma. And to do this, I'm going to run through the three brain systems that I mentioned. We're going to cover threat, reward, and memory systems. And for each of these, I'm really just going to try and capture the headline findings and what that might mean in relation to mental health vulnerability. So the threat system is the system we have to respond to key aspects of our environment that we believe to be predictive of harm. And the threat system is a kind of a necessary and universal phenomenon that we all have, and which is adaptive. It's not a problematic system. It's a necessary system to help us keep ourselves safe and respond to danger. But that threat system is very much calibrated by our early experience when we begin to learn about the world around us. And the baby and the infant and the child begins to learn, is the world a safe place? Is this a world that I need to be vigilant to respond to? Or is this a world where I can feel secure and attend to other things while the adults caring for me protect me and keep me safe? And what we know from psychological studies is that children who are exposed to physical maltreatment in particular, but also other kinds of maltreatment, are more likely to show hypervigilance to threat cues in the environment. And this is often measured by looking at cues of angry faces. So Seth Pollock and others have used faces like this in order to determine how many perceptual cues of threat are necessary to signal to the child that they're viewing an angry face. And what Seth Pollock and others have shown is that children who've experienced physical abuse, but also domestic violence, tend to have this pattern of being better than their peers and being able to identify that a face is showing anger relative to their peers. So that's what we see here in this graph, where children who've experienced abuse and neglect require fewer perceptual cues in the morphed image to make an accurate judgment that this is an angry face. And this is very specific to anger. It doesn't generalize to other expressions. So this is potentially an adaptive kind of change in the threat perception and attentional system for children growing up in these environments. Now, we have looked at this in the scanner in our first study in 2011. We sought to look at the neural basis of this pattern of hypervigilance, and we documented increased amygdala and anterior insula activation to these angry faces relative to neutral faces. And a meta-analysis has very much replicated now across a whole bunch of studies that this is the pattern we see in individuals experiencing childhood maltreatment. So this is really a set of neural correlates that kind of underpin the behavioral hypervigilance that we have seen in the studies of Seth Pollock. And one interesting observation is that you see a similar pattern in soldiers before and after they have been exposed to combat. And this is important for this reason. Some people say, well, how do we know that these children didn't have these brain patterns anyway? How do we know they weren't born with them? Well, what the studies with soldiers show is that we can measure soldiers before and after they've been exposed to environmental danger. And clearly this isn't ethical or possible with children, but with soldiers, you can document how does the brain adapt when they're exposed to the world of combat, which is intrinsically threatening. And we see alterations in the same set of regions. So this is work by Van Wingen and colleagues in the Netherlands, and they see two brain regions that adapt following exposure to combat, the amygdala and anterior insula. So this lends weight to our inference that what we see in children are patterns of adaptation that are consequent on exposure to environmental adversity. Now, when we see biological signals of threat, such as spiders, I had a huge bee which flew into the office yesterday, and you immediately detect that there is something here and there is a potential threat, and we're biologically wired to respond in that way because we have this what we might call low road or non-conscious road of signaling threat that obviates the cortical conscious pathway. And what's important about this is that it allows us to fractionate our responses to potential threat in the environment. And we've done this in a study of children, again, recruited in the same way from our other studies. So we generally recruit children with documented experiences of abuse and neglect from social services, and we match them carefully with children from the same neighborhoods and the same schools. And when we give them this task, which involves subliminal processing of threat, so the children had no conscious awareness of having even perceived an angry face, we find that even then, children who'd experienced violence at home showed this heightened response to threat cues, even outside conscious awareness. So this is really important because it tells us that the hypervigilance isn't something children are necessarily conscious of. It really is something which is deeply wired into how they're engaging with the world around them. And why is this relevant? Does it matter that this alteration in threat response that the brain is happening? Well, it does matter because we believe that these changes in the brain are predictive of future mental health problems, that these calibrations are essentially latent markers of vulnerability to future mental health problems. So when we looked here at a group of young adults, we looked at levels of maltreatment. And for those who self-reported maltreatment in childhood, we found, as we expected, elevated levels of threat reactivity, elevated levels of amygdala response, and that this in turn partially mediated the emergence of future anxiety and depression symptoms 1.5 to 2 years later. So this is what we mean by latent vulnerability. This pattern of neural adaptation occurs. It doesn't necessarily lead to an immediate mental health disorder, but it increased the vulnerability for that individual over time to developing mental health symptoms. In summary, we can see here that maltreatment has led to patterns of increased reactivity of the salience network and patterns then of hypervigilance and avoidance, and that can increase individual susceptibility to stress and anxiety and depression over time. And I don't have time here to talk about the avoidance of threat, but again, that might be something we can come to in the questions. The reward system is the second system we're going to look at, again, very briefly. And in some ways, it's sort of the inverse of the threat system. The reward system is really there to help us learn about positive aspects of our environment. It motivates our behavior and helps guide our decision making. And in this image, again, from the animation, you see a young child who is not receiving the feedback that they need to help reinforce, in terms of social reward, their interest and their attempts to form a connection. And the reward system is of particular interest to us because we know from studies of adolescents who are at risk of depression show altered patterns of reward response. So when you look at the neural regions in the brain, including the striatum, you can look at how responsive those regions are to reward cues in the environment. And what we've learned, and this is work by Agiris Stringaris, we've learned from researchers working with adolescents at risk for depression, is that they show a blunted response to reward cues in these reward-related areas. So that's really important, and that's a really profound finding in the field of depression. And what's really interesting about this, however, is that this blunted response predicts future clinical depression 2 years later. So the less responsive we are to reward in our environment, the more likely it is that we're going to develop depression later on. So maltreatment has been associated with the same pattern of blunting of response in the reward system. So Jamie Hansen, for example, has shown that emotional neglect is associated with blunted striatal response. Dennis and colleagues have shown that individuals with the highest response to social reward in terms of brain response are the ones least likely to show depression 2 years later. And in our own group, we have looked at how reward learning is different in children with maltreatment experience. At the current time, we're looking at apathy and effort processing. So we're trying to really fractionate what we think about in terms of the reward system. And part of this is the degree to which reward and effort are related to each other. And in this task, we ask our children to play a game. They can see a tree with apples and they've got to press a gripper in order for apples to fall from the tree. And the more you grip, the more apples fall. And we're able to vary the amount of gripping that's necessary for different apples to fall. And this is a computational task that allows us to very sensitively work out for each individual child how much effort they're really prepared to put in for different levels of reward. And then we can look at what's happening in terms of the brain. And this is something which has not yet been published, but we are seeing significant differences in how children who've experienced maltreatment are showing brain response during this process of exerting effort for reward. And we're also finding significant differences in their experience of apathy, such that it is elevated relative to their peers. In summary, maltreatment, childhood trauma, neglect, and abuse, these experiences appear to be associated with calibration of the reward system such that these brain regions, ventral striatum in particular, tend to show reduced or blunted responsiveness to social and monetary reward cues relative to peers. And we believe this in turn is associated with increased apathy and reduced motivation. And we've got good evidence from the wider field and from just 1 or 2 studies in the field of maltreatment that this is associated with an increased risk of depression over time. I want to then briefly talk about the autobiographical memory system. So this helps us draw from the past to essentially negotiate the future. So I had this slide, which I normally use when I talk about autobiographical memory, and realize this is not a world where most of us are currently having to negotiate. But of course, let's hope that we're all going to be going down a busy street sometime soon. And when we do that, we're going to really have to draw on our past experience of managing social groups and social environments, and that will help us negotiate new experiences in the world around us. So our memories of the past are really, really important in helping us effectively negotiate the future. And what happens when that memory access is impaired, it means that we are less able to negotiate the future, and we see higher levels of what are called social problem solving in individuals with poor autobiographical memory. And one way we can consider autobiographical memory is the specificity, the level of detail we have when we recall the past. And if you have an overgeneral pattern of autobiographical memory, that means you've got less access to detail in the past. And this pattern of overgeneral memory is associated again with depression and also actually with PTSD. And it might be that children who experience maltreatment over time begin to develop an overgeneral memory style because they begin to push away the memories of the past, because some of those memories are particularly traumatic, and that leads to an overgeneral memory style. So a range of other research teams have found this pattern of overgeneral memory style so it's essentially when you look at their recollections of past events and you compare it with their peers, they're essentially recalling less specificity and detail, both in relation to positive and negative memories. And this is what we replicated in this study. And then when you look in the scanner, when you look at how the brain responds to positive memory recall, you see reduced activation in the hippocampus. And this is consistent with reduced memory specificity. And when they recall negative memories, you see increased activation of the amygdala, part of this salience network that I spoke about earlier. So in a way, what we're seeing is that children who've experienced maltreatment are effectively privileging negative memories and failing to fully specify positive memories. And this is important because this is a pattern that is very similar to what you see in depression. We followed our young people up over 2 years, and we give them a mind-wandering task to look at their spontaneous thoughts. And we found that maltreatment was associated with fewer positive spontaneous thoughts than their peers. And this was also associated 2 years later, this overgeneral memory style. It was associated with less pro-social functioning and a trend level association with depression. So this seems to suggest that this overgeneral memory style over time has an impact on how the child is functioning, and maybe another latent vulnerability factor for future mental health problems. In summary, autobiographical memory systems appear to be calibrated following experiences of abuse and neglect, such that there is this pattern of overgeneral memory recall and a kind of a privileging of negative memories over positive memories. And we believe this contributes to rumination, poorer social problem solving, which again, we believe over time increases risk of depression and also potentially PTSD. So a brief summary, just as a brief pause before we go into the second half of the talk. We're seeing that neural markers of latent vulnerability are associated with threat reward and memory processing, and these are measurable before mental health problems emerge. So we see them in our participants even without mental health problems. We see these in brain regions commonly implicated in mental health problems associated with maltreatment, and we're seeing that they can predict future mental health function. So as I've said, we're going to now look at the second pathway, the socially mediated pathway. And this is looking forward to where the field, I believe, should be moving. And I think personally, it is a major gap in our understanding of how the brain relates to mental health vulnerability. Now, the social world, as we all know extremely personally over this last year, is intimately bound with our well-being and our mental health. And this is particularly true for physical health. And here I'm just drawing three main domains of social determinants of health: social status, social integration, and social experience. If we take social experience, for example, many of you will know that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, impact physical health. And here we see that they have an impact on longevity, how long someone lives. And when you have 6 or more ACEs, you're likely to live significantly less than your peers. When you look at social status, you see a very similar finding, simply here measured in terms of income. Again, greater income is associated with living longer. When you look at social integration, the degree to which we have a social network around us, again, the less integrated we are with the social network, the longer we live. So these findings that have been established for some time in terms of physical health also are mirrored in what we find in the context of mental health. So these social determinants also really impact our mental health and well-being and our risk of mental health problems over time. And what's really important in the context of childhood trauma is that they're also robustly associated with experiences of childhood adversity. And I'm going to talk you through some of that in the rest of this talk. And in doing so, I'm going to try and answer these two questions. So first, how does childhood trauma influence social determinants of mental health? And second, what is the role of altered neurocognitive function? And in doing this, I just want to take a step back just briefly to emphasize a really important point that I began with, which is that our social world is constructed in a transactional fashion. And Hertzman and Boyce capture this really beautifully in this quote. So they say social causation is iterative and recursive in the sense of involving repeated, self-amplifying exposures over time. Social adversities often involve autocatalytic, self-organizing feedback loops in which one traumatic event follows from others, giving rise over time to intensely negative and stressful social contexts. So there's a lot in this quote, but I just want to you to take away from it the fact that these social determinants unfold over time in an iterative and recursive transactional fashion. And that part of that is the way in which the individual is an agent that shapes the world around them, and how the world around them then shapes the individual. I'm going to talk you through 2 possible pathways in relation to childhood trauma, stress generation, and then I will introduce the concept of social thinning. Now, stress generation is a concept that is well established in the field of depression. We know that individuals prone to depression are more likely to experience interpersonal stressors in their life. So they're more likely to experience relationship breakdowns, for example, than their peers. And what we know is that individuals who've experienced childhood maltreatment are also at increased risk of future stressful life events. And historically, this has sort of been seen as an increased risk of victimization over time. But actually, when you look at the breadth of stressful events that occur, everything from relation difficulties to bullying, we see that maltreatment is robustly associated with a pattern of stress generation. And what is I'm just sort of highlighting here is that this again is from the animation, and John gets into a fight here with his friend because he misinterprets a playful nudge. And one key thing about stress generation is that, as I say, it depends on this interaction between the child and the world around them. So here we have the swim coach who could decide to exclude John from the swim team and then potentially escalate the level of stress generated from this original interaction, or the swim coach could decide to respond in a different way and find a different way for John to learn that that behavior wasn't appropriate, but retain him in the swim team. So the level of stress that emerges is really critically associated with how we as adults and systems around the child respond. And that goes for thinking about how a school responds to behavioral outbursts, whether that leads to exclusion or not, and also in relation to placements. Now, we have sought to find evidence for this phenomenon, and we here looked at the level of stressful life events in a group of young adults and sought to link that to future anxiety and depression symptoms. And what we found was that childhood experiences of abuse and neglect were associated with higher levels of everyday interpersonal stressful life events in these young adults, all of whom were at university, even when this was matched with a group of peers who were similar in every way we could think of, including baseline levels of mental health problems. And that this experience of stressful life events contributed to higher levels of anxiety and depression in the following year or two after these measures were taken. In other words, the mental health experience of these individuals are being impacted by their social experience now as young adults, not what happened in the past. So there's something about childhood maltreatment that's leading to this increased propensity to experience stressful life events of an interpersonal nature. And of course, that's in some ways not a surprise, I'm sure, to many of you who are very familiar with models of attachment. So whereas the stress exposure model emphasizes the impact of the original trauma, the social transactional model here really emphasizes the cumulative impact of future stressful life events that are generated in part as a function of early childhood experience, and also, I should say, likely to be in fact impacted by individual genetic differences as well. The second pathway I just want to briefly introduce, we're calling social thinning. And this is different, and this is a novel and new concept that we are developing, S.C. Beating and myself, to capture what we see in the data from longitudinal studies. So longitudinal studies who follow children who've experienced maltreatment and look at how they're functioning in their social worlds as adults, these studies have robustly indicated that such children grow up to be adults who have smaller social networks than their peers. They are also more likely to experience loneliness and have lower levels of social support. So even when you control for a range of potential confounding factors, you see this profound impact on social functioning later in life. And we are thinking about social thinning as a dynamic transactional process that over time leads to a pattern of attenuated social capital relative to peers, including the extent and quality of social relationships. And this social thinning is in some ways almost potentially invisible, because the child who gets excluded from the swim team, excluded from school, who is put into foster placement that breaks down, these losses of social connections over time accrue to create a social ecology which is relatively impoverished and attenuated relative to their peers. And that has an important impact, not just long-term in reducing the amount of social support that young person then has later in life, but it reduces the range of opportunities that young person has to learn about social skills and the opportunity to experience social interactions to build confidence and agency in the social world. And social thinning, we don't have time to go into a whole discussion on this, but even just a preliminary set of thoughts of how might social thinning arise? Well, it might be related to the propensity for the child to make new relationships. It might be related to their capacity to establish these relationships, or indeed the capacity to maintain the relationships and repair rupture. And again, as I've said, we can really bring in important psychological constructs here that are relevant to social thinning. I think thinking about attachment, thinking about mentalization, both entirely relevant and likely to have a significant impact on social thinning. We've recently been looking at facial trust processing as something that may impact the propensity to form relationships with others who you don't know. And we've developed a standardized computational task. This is a study led by Lenny Neal, one of the postdocs in our lab. And what we're using is this standardized set of faces. We're asking children to make very simple judgments: is someone trustworthy or not? And after multiple iterations, we can have a function of the degree to which they find other people trustworthy. And what we found is that children who've experienced maltreatment relative to very carefully matched peers are much less likely to think that faces are trustworthy, even those faces rated as highly trustworthy by their peers. And for any of us who've worked clinically with these children, we know this is just an experimental piece of evidence to support what our experience has been. And this lack of trust of others will make complete sense. It will be adaptive for children not to trust others, because that will have been their experience to date. But we can imagine if we are going into an environment, we go into a party, and your system is calibrated in a way to generally not find other people trustworthy, you can imagine how that's going to impact the very first step of beginning to make a social connection with someone else. Because of course we need to make friends before we can lose them. And the stress exposure model, I think, has a very limited way of thinking about social support, that by somehow increasing social support, you can buffer the impact of mental health problems. And it doesn't really attend to the way in which altered brain function and social functioning may make that a more complicated and difficult process, that these children may require something different from typically developing children. We've looked at these two pathways, social thinning and stress generation, but how do these alterations in social functioning relate to what's happening in the brain? And that's the area that I would like to flag as a key area for future research. How do alterations in the threat, reward, and memory systems contribute to the way in which these social determinants are constructed over time? So if I was going to put my money somewhere, I'm just going to give you two examples. I think that there's a real role for the reward system in thinking about stress generation. So we know blunted responsiveness that we've seen in the reward system will reduce the salience of positive social cues, and that will alter our approach behavior and potentially also increase aversion associated with loss. And this study by Mackin and colleagues is really interesting. It's looking at a group of adolescent girls, and it's finding that blunted response to reward is associated with higher levels of stress generation over an 18-month follow-up. So this provides good evidence that this is a very promising candidate system to look at reward and stress generation. And social thinning, I would really think that the threat system and heightened reactivity to threat is likely to increase experience of conflict and rupture, just as we saw in that cartoon example with John. And this is very closely associated with conduct problems, who we know have long-term poor social outcomes. And the threat system, the amygdala connectivity, we know in adults predicts social network size in adults. So we would suggest that by investigating heightened threat reactivity and salience processing, we would need to look at how do those neural calibrations that happen following trauma, how do they relate to future social functioning? Specifically, the level of social integration with others. So we've seen that there can be maladaptive early calibration of these neural systems that can lead to patterns of adverse social ecology being developed over time. We've talked about stress generation and social thinning that limit the amount of social learning opportunities, but also by adulthood really lead to an impoverished social ecology. And we believe that this can increase mental health risk. Conversely, we can think of children who have a positive outcome, a resilient outcome, and that can involve recalibration of neural systems in order to develop a more protective and enriched social ecology that can reduce mental health problems over time. So I'm conscious of time. I want to leave time for questions. I want to leave you with two main conclusions. The first is that mental health problems following adversity do not emerge overnight. Neuroscience is really showing us that vulnerability is measurable early and is providing a compelling rationale for a preventative approach so that we can think about where mental health problems come from and identify early vulnerability and think about how we may intervene to offset that trajectory. And I've introduced this idea of social mediation, this social transactional model, really to highlight that vulnerability following maltreatment is not simply something that's located in the child. People can think of something happening in the brain as something happening in a self-contained space, something in the child. They have a disorder, they have a brain that's different. But what I hope I've convinced you of is that these alterations in the brain have an impact on the developmental evolution of the child's social ecology over time. And we really need to learn how that relates to altered neurocognitive functioning. So what next? I would argue for developing a multi-level framework. We really need to bring together these different levels of understanding, all of which have valuable contributions to make. And in particular, we really need to relate the neuroscience to the developmental emergence of a child's social world. I also would suggest we need to advance prevention research by better understanding how neurocognitive alterations following maltreatment impact social determinants of mental health. So is reward, is threat processing, do those things impact social thinning and stress generation? At the moment, we don't know. I also think we need to identify malleable targets associated with the greatest potential to positively impact long-term relational functioning. So we need to have longitudinal studies that look at how to effectively intervene to prevent the emergence of mental health problems. And I would argue for the importance of the social domain in that context, but we need to be very specific. Should we be intervening to promote emotion regulation, trust processing, mentalization? What are the targets most amenable to change through preventative models of intervention that lead to reduced risk of mental health problems over time? And finally, I just want to leave you with the important point that this is not just about what's happening in the child. Responses of adults, of services, of systems around the child are really critical in this solution, because it's not just what is happening in the child, it's about how we as the world around the child respond. And I would suggest that that response needs to be underpinned by two core principles. The first, to mitigate this tendency to social thinning. Systems need to really seek to support and promote trusting relationships with others. So that has to be a key organizing principle. And there also needs to be a focus on inadvertent stress generation. We need to think about how these things can play out in ways that actually increase levels of stress in young people by how adults and systems around the child respond. So that's enough for me. I'm hoping we've got some time for questions, Peter, but thank you to everyone in the lab and the young people who participated, and also SE Beating in particular, who's a collaborator on all of this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Eamon. That was absolutely magisterial. That was fantastic. And I've heard many talks about trauma, but your clarity, the deceptive simplicity of the ideas just shows us how studying the brain actually helps us understand the entire social context in which traumatic experiences happen and the way their impact should be studied. I could go on.
Well, Peter, you've just gone on mute, I think inadvertently. Yeah, you're back.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. So got too many questions already. So try and be brief. The age at which children are most sensitive to adverse experiences.
Okay, I'll try and give quick answers, Peter, so we can get through these. So that's a really good question, and actually we don't have very good data on it, in part because it's been very hard to measure the way in which these experiences occur, because many children, as you will know, will have experiences across childhood. But the evidence that we've got points to the earlier, the more profound the changes, especially the first 2 years of life. We also see this in animal studies. So these systems around reward and threat in particular seem to be most sensitized to change in the early years, but there's also evidence of particular susceptibility in adolescence.
That's, thanks for that. A very interesting question about the relationship between one-off exposure versus repeated exposure. Could a one-off exposure to, say, a bad instance of bullying cause as much harm as a repeated exposure?
So this brings me back, Peter, to what I talked about earlier in terms of genetic vulnerability, because we'll have real individual differences. So for one individual, that might actually be the case, that for that individual, that one exposure could actually have a significant long-term impact relative to another child who may have had repeated episodes of bullying but not have had that impact. But those children may also differ in levels of protective factors and social support that might mitigate the impact of those adversities. But what we know as a general rule, when you look at kind of group findings, we know that there is a dose-dependent effect. So at the group level, the more that you experience adverse experiences, the more likely you have to have a negative outcome. But it can be very difficult to generalize in relation to an individual because of the fact that contexts will vary and genetic dispositions will vary.
An intriguing question, Eamon, about soldiers. Would a soldier with childhood adversity more likely to be traumatized by the combat experience?
So that's a brilliant question, Peter, and I had a slide on soldiers' response, which I didn't put because I had too many slides. But that's a brilliant question because there is a brilliant study by Admin and colleagues who show that level of amygdala reactivity before they go into combat predicts level of PTSD symptoms after combat. And they see this really broad range within the soldiers of how reactive their amygdala is. And what's so frustrating is that they didn't ask the soldiers to self-report childhood experiences. And what I would bet is that the high level of amygdala reactivity soldiers are the ones who will be most likely to have experienced abuse and neglect. So I don't think we've got evidence on that, but we know from general population studies is that heightened reactivity in the amygdala is associated with both increased mental health problems following combat and also increased experience of maltreatment in childhood. So I would put my money on that that's indeed what is happening. But there will also be some genetic contribution to that. So some people will have a highly reactive amygdala to threat just as a result of genetic predisposition.
Another totally unrelated question, Eamon. Would a child with the abnormalities that you've identified associated with trauma react differently to the social experiences that they encounter and experience them as more traumatic than other children, so that the trauma, in a sense, is repeated for them by the neurodevelopmental abnormality?
So I think that's a really, really helpful question, Peter. So first of all, I wouldn't think about, I would really be keen not to use the word abnormalities. I kind of prefer the word adaptations. But if you have a child who is, for example, developing this pattern, let's just take autobiographical memory. They develop a more overgeneral autobiographical memory that impacts their social problem solving. Well, you can just think, well, then maybe that will mean in the next time they experience a difficult social situation, that won't turn out very well, which leads to them breaking up with their friends, which leads to a different social ecology, which is more impoverished with more stress. And then that becomes an environment that they're even less equipped to deal with, and they have less learning opportunities in order to develop those capacities as with their peers. So I think that there is this really insidious transactional iterative process where a child's early adaptation play out in this way, and that's what we think is happening when we think about social thinning as well as stress generation.
Thanks, Eamon. Carrying on from social thinning, is the experience of social thinning different depending on the kind of culture that an individual may grow up in? So a collective versus individualistic culture, societies with high and low trust in others or in governments.
So I think that's a brilliant area for future research, Peter. I think I should emphasize to people that social thinning is a really new construct that we have actually published very little on, and I just want to share with you now. But we know from longitudinal studies that it is a phenomenon, and I'm not sure people have looked at it in that way, but I would imagine there are likely to be real differences in patterns of social thinning depending on cultural differences and also levels of trust. And I suspect we could probably get some insight into that by looking at the social determinants literature and seeing whether these factors in general impact the construction of integrated social networks in the general population.
Lisa, this is an unfair question. I shouldn't really be asking you this, but I will all the same. What, in your view, is the most impactful practical thing that can be done in schools to mitigate the effect of traumatic experiences in early teens? What's the single thing?
I think the single thing, Peter, if I was to put my money on something, is to help the adults around the child step back and reflect and reframe the behavior in the context of childhood trauma, so that the behavior is not seen simply through the lens of this is a child misbehaving. So in the animation that we have on the UK Trauma website that we developed with teachers, actually, Peter, I mean, if you watch that, I would really hope teachers could then see that how they perceive behavior can really be profoundly rethought by putting a different understanding on the meaning of that behavior. So what does behavior mean? And in a school situation, it's very easy to see problematic behavior is playing up or being aggressive, and that requires a punitive response. So the single thing that I would do would be to help teachers really think about the different ways in which meaning can be attributed to a child's behavior, and in particular, how behavior can be impacted by trauma.
That's very helpful. Let me ask another question. in relation to reward that a number of people have asked. Now, will the decreased sensitivity to positive reward, will that impair a capacity of a teacher or someone else working with the child to modify behavior? Should they take that into account as they are interacting with the child?
So again, Peter, I think this is something which we need more data on, but my guess is that this blunted response to reward will mean that these children who've grown up in environments where rewards are likely to be very sparse or unpredictable will actually need greater levels of reward signaling in order to engage the same level of motivation than their peers, so that they're more likely to need that to be signaled. In the same way that we think about trust, we know that they're going to be very vigilant about trust. We need to have clearer signals about trustworthiness, about consistency. I think the same goes for reward, that it's likely that they will need heightened signals of reward. And that might be about consistency. It might be about making things explicit in the same way that you think about, punishment cues when people misbehave. To promote positive behaviors, these children probably really require enriched experiences of reward that are consistent and salient. And that's a hypothesis, but that's what I would infer from the findings to date.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really helpful. Eamon, I really wish that we had some more time. We are unfortunately at the edge of the time allotted to us. I really want to thank you for what was an absolutely brilliant, and I'm sure for many of us, an eye-opening talk on trauma. There is much more that we can learn from you, that we will learn from you. You have referred us to some invaluable material. And I would say if there's one message that I take away from this, is a message of enormous positivity, that the impact of trauma is not a one-off experience, it's a process. It's something that happens over time, and it may have a trajectory of a cascade of every event leading to something worse, and ultimately mental health problems of quite a severe kind. But also in that is a message of hope, that if we do things differently, if we focus on how we're going to prevent as opposed to exaggerate mental health problems, then it is a process that's reversible because it is something that's born of and born in a social interactive context that is our society and exactly. The society that we make.
Exactly, and just to say, to end on that positive note, the brain is malleable, and those changing social interactions will continue to change the brain.
Yours might still be. Mine is all malleable in all the wrong ways. So, Eamon, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for spending time with us, and thank you everybody for attending. I just want to remind you that to complete the feedback form, otherwise Eamon's self-esteem will suffer a catastrophic, traumatic decline. So please fill in the form, and also come again soon. Thank you very much.